Hey, everybody, Happy New Year. We are back for another year. So, welcome and get ready for the Supply Chain Solutions Weekly Ship Show series. For 20 years, we have pursued a vision to deliver the future of global logistics today. And all of us at SCS understand that the world of supply chains is really increasingly volatile. And we pride ourselves on our agility and our responsiveness to develop solutions that create sustainable value for our customers. So if you could do Jason and I and Vanessa a favor this year, spread the word and don't forget to join us each week as we unpack the emerging trends and the high-level issues that will affect your supply chains, because at Supply Chain Solutions, we always deliver value quickly, affordably, and flawlessly. Now, we have a great show this week, and unfortunately, Jason won't be joining us because he's traveling. But this week, we are going to talk about the 2023 shipping market outlook to kick off the year. And what's really amazing is I think we're in for one heck of a ride this year. I mean, the shipping market is going to face some really major challenges in 2023. Things like freight rates and volumes and demand falling. And really, after more than 2 years of rising rates and shortages of capacity and the rapidly cooling ocean freight market, I think we're really set for an extremely challenging 2023. So I'd like to just high level touch on a few things that I think are going to be major challenges for supply chain in 2023 before we go into what our outlook is for this year. So I think some of the things everyone needs to expect is the changes in consumer buying behavior. E-commerce is now the preferred buying method. And a lot of that is affected by inflation. Global port congestion is another one of those challenges. And, when you think about it, more than 2 years of pandemic related delays, labor shortages, lack of proper infrastructure, that ripple effect created a massive clogging at major ports and warehouses. Warehouses exceeded capacity, and it really resulted in supply chain operations scrambling for space. So we've got changes in consumer buying behavior, global port congestion, and then one of the other things that is really going to affect supply chains is the digitization, and I would challenge everyone to say that word 3 times, but digitization and automation. When you think about it, many organizations are still doing business the traditional way. I remember when I started out in this business 36 years ago, I remember typing airway bills and, stamping bills of lading. And I think, the automation of various menial and repetitive processes in the supply chain is critical. It's critical to get these things automated. And I think if we can do that, it's going to be indispensable for companies. And that's one of the reasons why everyone needs to learn more about the Supply Chain Solutions new platform coming out at the end of the first quarter. It's really an amazing platform that we're going to be rolling out to everyone. And, it's kind of like going from a Model T Ford to Star Trek with predictive analytics and artificial intelligence and amazing dashboards and measurables. It's really something. So if companies haven't thought about digitizing their supply chain, you're already behind the 8 ball because the pandemic put us in hyperdrive. And it really accelerated that process. And then the other thing we need to think about is rising cost. As inflation continues to spiral out of control, rising cost of everything are going to affect organizations' profit margins and their service quality. So that's another thing we need to think about. And then it's the lack of sustainability, that ESG, that environmental social governance, and how that directly impacts supply chains with the legalities that surround it. these unjust practices, dealings becoming more stringent with the carbon emissions and human rights and trade sanctions. We ourselves ran into a situation over in China last year with some of the unfair trade practices with the Uyghur population. That we noticed that was a real big dynamic that affected some things coming out of China. So, that whole lack of sustainability and that ESG is really directly impacts supply chains. And then there's the geopolitical uncertainty, things like Ukraine, Taiwan, challenges in India. And some of those challenges in India mainly stem from poor infrastructure, in addition to a lot of the fragmented networks and distribution systems and the negligible technology that they have over there are really going to compound a lot more in 2023. So, like I said, there's about 6 or 7 things that are really going to affect supply chains this year. And one of those last things is, what are the strategies that are going to help solve supply chains challenges? Are companies really going to take the plunge and go through that digital transformation, adopting things like cloud-based solutions, which can really assist supply chain managers when it comes to developing contingency plans for potential impacts to their supply chains? And it's going to allow them to be more flexible when sourcing products from other countries. But aside from those supply chain challenges, there's really some economic challenges that await us in 2023. Things like the imminent recession, stubborn inflation, China's COVID chaos, the energy crisis, and the geopolitical tensions and the technology war between the USA and China. And, when you think about the imminent recession in 2023, I believe we're already in a recession. And from everything that Jason and I have been studying, we really believe that this, 2023 is expected to be the 3rd worst year for global economic growth this century, behind 2009, when the global financial crisis caused a great recession. And then we had 2020, when COVID-19 lockdowns brought the global economy to a virtual standstill. So, this recession is really going to be challenging for all of us this year, particularly if the central banks continue raising interest rates, to tamper or to temper the demand of, for consumer goods and services, to try to rein in inflation. So it's really something to think about. And then, again, it's a great segue to stubborn inflation. I think prices will likely be rising moderately in 2023. And I think the reason it's only going to be moderate is because there's a weakening demand, falling energy prices, easing of supply chain snarls, and the decline of shipping costs are really going to offset some of those potential big, rate hikes. So I think really, in the second half of the year, rate hikes might be a little moderate. However, inflation, I really believe, is going to be central, to everything, particularly the inflation in the Eurozone, which is expected to come down more slowly than in the US. For example, Germany is the Eurozone's economic engine. So inflation is expected to fall thanks to measures like a cap on gas and power prices, but core inflation, which strips out volatile food and energy prices, could remain stubbornly high as a result of the government's cash transfers to thousands of households, not only in the EU, but also in the USA, which result in higher, living costs. So stubborn inflation is another one of those things that's going to be a factor. And then China's COVID chaos is another one. Just weeks before the start of 2023, China announced an exit from its controversial zero COVID policy. So, you hear a lot of things, is Shanghai locked down? Are they not locked down? Seems like they're opening up now, and now the US is preventing, Chinese nationals from coming into our country because they're afraid of COVID. So, um, I think, going by experience of other countries, I think this deluge of infections is expected to cause really short-term disruption to the world's second largest economy, which is China. And this could really deal a major blow to the fragile recovery of the global supply chain. Okay. And there's also the risk of new coronavirus variants emerging and spreading to other parts of the world. So this whole dynamic about China's COVID chaos is something we really need to keep our finger on the pulse of to see how this plays out. And then one of the other things that I think is really important, and some of the notes I made preparing for today's show, is the energy crisis. And I think we're really in a precarious energy situation right now, especially in Europe, because I think it's going to continue to give headaches to governments in 2023. Europe might just manage to escape a complete energy crisis this winter, thanks to a milder than normal weather and consumers cutting their energy uses. But I think the lower demand for heating means that many of the region storage facilities, which were filled to the brim last year, might remain well stocked at the end of this winter. And that's likely to keep gas prices in check next spring, helping to pull down inflation in the EU. But the situation could still really become challenging ahead of next winter. When you think about it, having spent hundreds of billions of euros last year scouting for alternatives to Russian energy, Europe really might struggle to fill up its storage facilities again. And now that the competition for liquefied natural gas will be especially tough as China reopens and traditional Asian buyers like Japan and Korea start looking for more sources of energy, that's just a whole nother fly in the ointment in this whole energy crisis. So energy really remains a risk factor for all regions, coupled with a possible shortage of gas in the winter of 2023 and 2024. And although most Americans, we see our energy bills going up, our gas bill, our electric bill, things like that, it may not seem like it's that great of an impact, but some of these energy shortages in other countries around the world is really a big issue. And then I think lastly, before we get to the market outlook, I think we really have to keep a close eye on the geopolitical tensions and the technology war. I think the military and the political tensions are going to continue to be strong and robust, in 2023. And I don't really see an end in sight to this Russian war in Ukraine. And then you got to think about the US-China frictions over Taiwan and the world's top semiconductor manufacturer, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSM. And you also have to think about the soaring tensions in Korea, in the Korean Peninsula, amid North Korea's missile testing. So I think these type of things are really going to keep investors on their toes this year. And I think like I said, the solutions to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine really remain elusive. And this in turn really means that no solutions to knock on this. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that there's really no silver bullet solution to end this conflict. And, things like the migration movements, the global supplies of fossil energy and commodities and foods, and this potential geopolitical shift extending far beyond the region is really going to affect everything. And I think, this battle for the technological supremacy between the US and China might get more intense in 2023. I mean, when you think about it, And Supply Chain Solutions is heavily involved with the BIS, with the Bureau of Industry and Security. And when you think about that, last year, Washington banned the transfer of advanced US semiconductor technology to China. So, this has really morphed into a trade conflict. Okay. And, then we have to think about this whole situation with 5G and artificial intelligence and again, chips. So, this success will expand the country's power base over the long term. But, I think both the USA and China are not going to want to yield any ground easily when it comes to these geopolitical tensions and this technology war. So all these things, these supply chain challenges like changes in consumer buying behavior, port congestion, digitization, rising costs, lack of sustainability, geopolitical uncertainty, and these economic challenges like an imminent recession and stubborn inflation and the COVID chaos in China and the energy crisis are all going to be factors that are going to affect all facets of business in 2023, which is a really great segue into what we believe the overall market outlook is going to look like this year. And I think, the container shipping sector has enjoyed an unprecedented boom during and after the pandemic. And I think, the coming year sees a difficult combination of sluggish demand and sharply rising fleet growth. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the trade growth, okay, and what the outlook for that is. So when we think about trade growth, there really has been an overbuilding of inventories. Many companies are not, have too much inventory or not holding the right inventory. And then when you think about the pressures of the housing markets due to interest rates, and also the pressures on consumers' disposable incomes, those are big factors. So that trade growth outlook, at least for the first half of 2023, is going to be pretty challenging. And that is a great segue into the fleet growth forecast. So when we speak about fleet growth, we're talking about supply chain tonnage, meaning new vessels. So when ship owners have ships built, they talk about it or refer to it as tonnage. Okay, so this is really the big immovable object coming down the line this year for the container market. And they're going to really struggle to balance that supply growth. And it's going to accelerate noticeably as more vessels come into the rotation. And I saw a really great article from the MSI, the Maritime Strategies International Council, and they are forecasting a 7% fleet growth year on year in both 2023 and 2024. And I think we're going to have above average growth in 2025, if I recall reading about that. So, when you think about it, fleet growth could be as high as 10% a year if there's no vessel scrapping. And what that means is a lot of ship owners will start to scrap some of their older vessels that are not environmentally friendly and just don't have the capacity as some of the mega vessels, coming into the rotation over the next 3 years. And you could see these ship owners start to scrap vessels in an effort to control the space and the capacity. And it's not far-fetched. It could really happen. And then we have to think about congestion and capacity. So here in the US, everybody thinks, wow, there's no more congestion. Well, guess what? Even though congestion is clearing up, especially quayside, inland, okay, there are still isolated pockets of congestion, not only in the USA, maybe not necessarily at the port, but particularly inland, okay, and to IPI points, in Chicago Rail, okay, the Chicago Rail Hub, at the Kansas City Rail Hub, and many of the major rail hubs, there's still a lot of congestion. So, I think that everyone has seen that the pandemic has been really marked by severe supply chain disruption and congestion in the container shipping, but now that's changing. And I think you're going to see pretty sizable loss of effective capacity over this period that coincided with the pandemic. So now I think that's all going to start to unwind, and we're seeing congestion really open up. I mean, we're seeing rates into the West Coast now for under $2,000, and into the East Coast, we're seeing rates maybe, under $3,500. So we're really seeing it open up, and then that's a good gear shift into the container freight rates, because I think in the latter half of 2022, we really saw an extremely sharp drop in the spot container freight rates. And Jason and I were just talking about this yesterday. And when you think about that sharp drop in the spot container freight rates, which are now much lower than contract rates that were agreed to between shippers and container ship lines earlier this year, the data really shows that there's a definite sign that contract rates are starting to fall as well. So you have to think about it. There's a lot of companies out there, these BCOs, these beneficial cargo owners, that sign contracts directly with container ship lines. And now there's a really big risk that some of these container ship lines will not renegotiate some of the pricing, because people sign for rates that are much higher now than the rates currently are. So that's a real fly in the ointment. And I think, a high proportion of the contracts are going to come up for renewal in the first half of next year. And I think it's really clear that the lines are going into that renewal season not on the greatest footing, which I'm happy to say. I'm kind of happy about that. I'd say for the last 3 years, the container ship lines held all the cards, had all the power, and now that dynamic is changing, and it's going to become a shipper's market. And blank sailings could, we're seeing that blank sailings aren't proving to be as an effective method of controlling the space and capacity to keep those rates high, which is what the container ship lines wanted, as it was during the pandemic. So even though they're implementing blank sailings now, that strategy is not, paying the dividends to them as it once did. And I think, the level of drop off in contract rates is really going to vary by line, by container ship line, by trade focus, and the amount of the spot rate versus the contract rate business that particular line has. So you have to think of that dynamic. There's spot rate business and there's contractual business that all companies deal with when you're dealing with the container ship lines. But I don't really expect contract rates to fall all the way back to the weakest market levels in the pre-pandemic era. We're close, but I don't think it's going to quite hit that weakest level. And then I think lastly, the last thing we really need to think about is the impact of the container lines earnings. And I think the big question for lines is when the falling freight rates start to impact their earnings, that becomes a real big problem for them. And you have to remember that they had record level earnings in the third quarter of 2022, all throughout the last couple of years. And the first thing you'll see is that different lines are going to experience the next several quarters in different ways. So ONE or Maersk or MSC might experience things differently than, say, Evergreen or NYK lines or some of the other alliances, the 2M alliance, okay? So that's a whole dynamic that we really have to look at. And, the lines that have a particular focus on the spot business out of the Trans-Pacific Asia to the USA trades are likely to come under a lot more pressure sooner than the bigger, more diverse lines that have a more diverse cargo base across different regions. And you have to remember, a lot of these container ship companies just don't move containers. Maersk Line moves containers. They move bulk carriers, they do liquid gas carriers, they even have some oil tanker business that they're involved in. So companies like Maersk, you know, they're going to experience things a lot differently because their diversity is a lot different than some of the pure just container ship lines. And I think similarly, lines with more contract business versus spot cargo business are really going to see more earnings longevity. So I really think we're looking more towards the middle of next year for the industry as a whole with respect to the big earnings picture to look more normal. But, you know, I do think that, you know, the level of ultra thin margins that we're seeing during some of the pre-pandemic years, or, you know, I don't know that we're going to see that again. But again, 2023 is going to be one of those years where there's going to be a big ebb and flow to the business. It's going to be a bit of a wild ride. And we just want everyone to know that you need to tune into the Ship Show series each week with Jason and I, so we can unpack these emerging trends, these give you that 50,000 foot view. And we just have a whole slew of incredible guests that are going to be on the show this year. So that's sort of our outlook for 2023. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm going to send it back to Vanessa now to see if we have any questions.
Hi, Anthony. We do have one question that popped here. Still having a hard time getting space in vessels timely. Blank sailings and just capacity issues. Any tips there on how to get on the vessel?
Well, I hate to say it this way, but you need to work with Supply Chain Solutions, and you really need to look at your demand planning, but also your forecasting as well. Because I think one of the most important things is it's about having relationships in a local environment that know how to ensure the smooth flow of the cargo and the communications through the supply chain. And that starts with securing space on the vessel and getting your vessel booked. So, you know, I've always said to people, anybody can move freight from point to point, but it's about the relationships in a local environment that make a difference. In Supply Chain Solutions, you know, our chairman, Jim Ward, and our CEO, Les Brand, have done some incredible things in building our company and building our company's global footprint. So we do have those relationships in a local environment. So I would just say, forecast, give us that forecast as soon as you can. And, you know, typically we don't have an issue getting on the vessel. So there's no silver bullet answer except to work with us.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, that's the only questions we had for today. Honestly, I would suggest, it was an anonymous question, but I would suggest just send Anthony an email. You guys will be getting a follow-up email tomorrow with the replay of the show, the link to the recordings, and Anthony and Jason's email are going to be there. So just email them. Easy peasy. They can help you out. Anthony, thank you so much for your time, for all your knowledge. It's a pleasure to be back, and let's have a great 2023.